The first sound was the splintering of wood, a violent crack that tore through the drowsy afternoon quiet of Redemption Creek. Then came the glass, a shower of crystalline shards, exploding inward from the bank's front window. For Jack Thorne, the world dissolved into chaos. One moment he was standing at the teller's cage, the receipt for his latest cattle sale in hand. The next, he was on the floor, the air thick with gun smoke and the screams of his neighbors. Rough hands shoved him down the cold steel of a rifle barrel, pressing against his back. "Stay down, rancher," a voice rasped. "Your money ain't worth your life." Jack's gaze swept the room. 4 men, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, moved with brutal efficiency. 2 stood guard at the shattered window, and the door, their rifles aimed at the terrified townsfolk huddled on the floor. A third was behind the counter, stuffing wads of cash into a canvas sack. The 4th man, the leader, stood in the center of the room, directing the robbery not with shouts, but with quiet, chilling gestures. He was taller than the others, his movements possessing a liquid grace that was unnervingly calm amidst the panic. His eyes, cold and dark above the bandana, missed nothing. Jack's hand instinctively went to his chest, to the small lump in his breast pocket. It was always there, a silver locket, oval-shaped and intricately engraved with intertwined roses. Inside was a miniature portrait of his wife Sarah, her smile frozen in time. He had given it to her on their wedding day, and after the outlaw raid that had stolen her from him 5 years ago, he had carried it ever since. It was a talisman against the hollowing grief, a constant physical reminder of the life they had shared. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, a man whose courage was far smaller than his paunch, was babbling from behind his desk. "Take it all. Just don't hurt anyone." The leader's cold eyes flickered toward the sound. He took 2 silent steps and leveled his pistol at Peterson's head. The manager's pleas choked into a terrified whimper. The leader said nothing, his silence more menacing than any threat. His gaze then shifted, sweeping across the customers on the floor, and for a heart-stopping moment, his eyes met Jack's. There was no recognition, no flicker of familiarity. Yet Jack felt a primal jolt, an instinctual dread that went beyond the immediate danger of the robbery. This man moved with a purpose that felt sharper, more personal than simple greed. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the street. Sheriff Miller, bless his aging, stubborn heart, was making a stand. One of the robbers at the window grunted, clutching his arm as he staggered back. The leader reacted instantly. "Time to go," he commanded, his voice a low, controlled growl. As his men scrambled for the exit, he raised his own pistol not toward the sheriff, but into the room, a parting gesture of chaos. He fired once, a random, cruel shot aimed at the huddled mass on the floor. The world seemed to slow. Jack saw the flash, the puff of smoke. He felt a sledgehammer blow to his chest that threw him backward, knocking the air from his lungs. Pain, sharp and blinding, radiated from his ribs. He heard a woman scream his name. His vision swam the ornate ceiling of the bank, blurring into a dark, swirling vortex. Sarah. He thought, a wave of resignation washing over him. "I'm coming." But death did not take him. The darkness receded, replaced by the concerned face of Doc Adams leaning over him. The sounds of the bank slowly returned to focus, sobbing the distant pounding of hoofbeats as the robbers fled, the sheriff shouting orders. Jack, can you hear me?" Doc Adams' voice was strained. Jack coughed, a ragged, painful sound. His chest was a single throbbing ache. He tried to sit up, but the doctor's hand on his shoulder held him down. "Easy, son. You took a hard knock." "The bullet." Jack rasped his hand, fumbling at his breast pocket. His fingers found a warped, concave piece of metal. He pulled it out. The silver locket. Sarah's locket. A deep, ugly crater marred the engraved roses. The silver twisted and blackened. The bullet was lodged within the mangled metal, its lead nose peeking through a tear in the back. The locket had stopped the bullet. It had saved his life. Jack stared at the ruined memento, a storm of emotions churning within him. Relief, sharp and dizzying, mingled with a profound, aching sorrow. The locket, his last tangible piece of Sarah, was destroyed. And yet, in its destruction, it had preserved the life she had once shared. He closed his fist around the warm, dented metal, the sharp edges digging into his palm. The leader of the robbers, the man with the cold, purposeful eyes, had not just stolen the town's money. He had desecrated a memory. He had put a bullet through Jack's heart, and only a piece of silver had stopped it from being fatal. In that moment, lying on the cold floor of the Redemption Creek Bank, a new feeling took root in the fallow ground of Jack Thorne's grief, a cold, hard seed of rage. 2 weeks passed, and an uneasy calm settled over Redemption Creek. The bank robbery was the only topic of conversation, a shared trauma that bound the community in a fragile solidarity. Jack Thorne, his ribs bruised, but his body intact, became a reluctant symbol of that day. He deflected the townsfolk's sympathetic inquiries with curt nods and turned his attention back to his ranch, seeking solace in the familiar rhythms of work. The Thorne Ranch was the largest in the valley, a legacy built by his father and now his responsibility. It was a heavy mantle, one he had once dreamed of sharing with Sarah. Now it was just land and cattle, a duty to be performed. His life was structured around 2 poles, the ranch and Lily. His late brother's daughter, Lily, was a whirlwind of teenage energy and emotion, all sharp angles and sharper wit. At 16, she possessed a fierce independence that reminded Jack painfully of Sarah. He had become her guardian after his brother and sister-in-law were taken by fever 3 years prior, and he loved her with a fierce protective loyalty, though he rarely knew how to show it. He was a man more comfortable with branding irons than with feelings, and the gulf of grief that separated him from the world often felt too wide to bridge, even with the niece, who was his only remaining family. "You're quiet tonight," Lily observed, pushing a piece of stew around her plate. They sat at the long wooden table in the ranch house kitchen, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. "Just tired," Jack said. It was his standard reply, a wall he built around himself. "Doc Adams said you were lucky." She pressed her young face, etched with a worry that made her look older than her years. "He said the locket." She trailed off, unwilling to speak of the object that had been a constant presence in her uncle's life. Jack's hand unconsciously went to his pocket, where the dented locket now rested, a heavy, misshapen weight. He didn't answer. He couldn't. To speak of Sarah was to invite the pain back in, and he had spent 5 years learning how to keep it at bay. The following Monday, a new presence arrived in Redemption Creek, as quiet and unassuming as the bank robbery had been violent. Her name was Eleanor Vance, the new schoolteacher from St. Louis. Jack first saw her at the general store. Her posture ramrod straight, her dress simple but well made, a stark contrast to the worn denim and calico of the local women. She was speaking to Mr. Daniels, the proprietor, her voice low and clear, her questions about school supplies precise and intelligent. There was a reserve about her, a careful stillness in her gray eyes that spoke of a past she held close. She looked like a woman who had learned to be self-reliant, not by choice, but by necessity. Their paths crossed again at the town council meeting where Jack sat as a member. Eleanor stood before them, a picture of composure as she outlined her plans for the school year. She spoke of new primers she had ordered, of the importance of geography and history alongside reading and arithmetic. Her intelligence was palpable, but so was her guardedness. When Mr. Peterson, the bank manager, asked a pointed question about why a woman of her education would choose a remote town like Redemption Creek, a flicker of something fear or perhaps anger crossed her face before being swiftly suppressed. "I believe in the promise of the West," she answered smoothly. "And I believe every child, no matter where they live, deserves a proper education." Jack found himself watching her, intrigued. She was an enigma, a woman of evident refinement, who had willingly chosen the hardship of the frontier. Like him, she seemed to be carrying a history she had no intention of sharing. Their initial interactions were brief and professional nods on the street, a polite Mr. Thorne, a formal Miss Vance. Neither made an effort to breach the other's defenses. Redemption Creek itself was a town caught between hope and harsh reality. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, a constant reminder of the unforgiving land. The faces of its citizens were etched with the struggles of frontier life. The weary sheriff, the pragmatic doctor, the hopeful settlers, and the wary old-timers. It was a community held together by a shared desire for a peaceful life, a desire that had been brutally shattered by the bank robbery. That peace was shattered again, a month after the robbery, not by gunfire, but by the stroke of a pen. The news spread through town like a prairie fire. The failing saloon, along with several adjacent properties, had been purchased by an unknown buyer. The buyer, it turned out, was the leader of the bank robbers. He didn't send an agent. He walked into the town clerk's office himself, his face now clean-shaven and free of a bandana, and paid in cash that every soul in Redemption Creek knew was their own. His name, he said, was Silas Blackwood. He was the man with the cold eyes. Jack knew it the moment he saw him standing on the saloon's porch overseeing its renovation. Blackwood met Jack's stare from across the street, and a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, predatory triumph. This wasn't a man hiding from the law. This was a man making a statement. Redemption Creek was no longer a refuge. It had become a hunting ground. Silas Blackwood did not behave like a common outlaw laying low. He behaved like a king surveying his new domain. He hired local men to rebuild the saloon, paying them handsomely and promptly. He dressed in tailored suits that spoke of city wealth, his calm, confident demeanor, a stark contrast to the frantic violence of the robbery. He was a wolf who had shed his skin to walk among the sheep, and the flock was terrified. Jack watched him, a cold knot of dread tightening in his gut. This was wrong. A man who led a violent bank robbery did not turn around and invest the stolen money in the very town he had terrorized. There was a deeper game being played, and Jack felt with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was the quarry. His fears were confirmed within a week. A notice was posted on the sheriff's door, a legal challenge filed by Mr. Silas Blackwood against the Thorne Ranch's primary water rights to Crimson Creek. The claim was audacious, citing an obscure territorial law and a supposed discrepancy in the original survey from 20 years ago. It was a direct assault on the ranch's lifeblood. Without those water rights, Jack's herds would perish and his land would turn to dust. He stormed into Sheriff Miller's office, the notice crumpled in his fist. "You see this? This is a declaration of war." Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary face showed the strain of decades on the frontier, sighed and rubbed his temples. "It's a legal document, Jack. Filed proper and all. He's got some fancy lawyer from Helena handling it." "He's a bank robber. A murderer." Jack's voice was raw with frustration. "You and I both know he's the one who led that raid. Why is he still walking free?" "Knowing and proving are two different things," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with resignation. No one got a clear look at his face during the robbery. "Your word against his. He's got money, Jack. Lots of it. And in this territory, money shouts a hell of a lot louder than justice." The next blow came 2 days later. Hank, his foreman, rode in from the north pasture, his face a mask of fury. "Rustlers," he spat. 50 head vanished clean as you please. Cut the fence near the bluffs. The tracks lead east, but they scattered him in the rocky flats. It was a professional job. 50 head. A significant loss. But it was the brazenness of the act that enraged Jack. It was another message from Blackwood, a demonstration of his reach and his contempt. Jack knew without a shred of doubt that Blackwood's men were responsible. The legal challenges and the rustling were just the beginning. Blackwood began a subtle campaign to poison the town against him. He offered generous credit at his saloon, bought rounds for disgruntled ranch hands, and listened with a sympathetic ear to their grievances. He spread whispers about the Thorne family's wealth, suggesting that Jack's father had acquired his vast lands through less than honorable means. Fearful and struggling townsfolk, already intimidated by Blackwood's power, began to look at Jack with a mixture of resentment and suspicion. The man who had been a respected community leader was slowly being cast as an arrogant land baron, hoarding resources while others struggled. It was a systematic, calculated destruction aimed not just at Jack's finances, but at his name, his legacy, and his standing in the community he had sworn to protect. The grieving widower, who had sought only to be left alone with his memories, was being forced into a fight. Blackwood's vendetta was no longer a suspicion. It was a palpable, suffocating reality. Jack Thorne had to act not just to save his ranch, but to defend the very foundations of his life. Jack chose to fight Silas Blackwood on the only battlefield he thought he could win the law. He spent days poring over his father's old ledgers and deeds, meticulously gathering the documents that proved his family's legitimate claim to the Crimson Creek water rights. He rode the fence lines himself, documenting the cut wires and collecting what little evidence the rustlers had left behind, a dropped branding iron, with an unfamiliar mark, a unique set of hoofprints from a shod horse. He presented his case to Sheriff Miller, laying out the deeds and the evidence on the sheriff's cluttered desk. "This is proof, Sam. The water rights are mine clear as day. And that branding iron, I'll bet my last dollar it belongs to one of the men Blackwood hired for his renovations." The sheriff examined the papers, his expression troubled. "This is good, Jack. It's solid. But Blackwood's already filed his counterclaim." He slid a sheaf of documents across the desk. They were notarized affidavits from 2 supposed surveyors, complete with complex diagrams, all swearing that the original survey was flawed. He also had a bill of sale for 50 head of cattle, signed by a rancher from 2 counties over, dated the day of the rustling. Paid witnesses and forged documents. Jack said, his voice flat and hard. He's buying his own reality. "And people are believing it," the sheriff added grimly. "He's got folks convinced you're a bully trying to muscle him out." "My hands are tied, Jack. Without a confession or a reliable witness to the rustling itself, this becomes a civil matter for the courts. And that'll take months, maybe years. By then, your ranch could be dried up and bankrupt." Jack left the sheriff's office with the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. He felt trapped, outmaneuvered by an enemy who played by no rules. He stood on the dusty main street watching as Blackwood exited the saloon, laughing with a group of men. Blackwood's eyes found Jack's, and he gave a slight, mocking nod. The arrogance of the man was infuriating. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, the weight of his predicament pressing down on him, there was a soft knock at his front door. It was Eleanor Vance. She stood on his porch, a lantern in one hand and a roll of papers in the other, her expression one of quiet determination. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady, "forgive the late hour. I was at the town hall reviewing the school district archives, and I overheard Mr. Peterson discussing your situation with Blackwood." Jack stiffened. "It's ranch business, Miss Vance. Nothing that should concern you." "Tyranny concerns me, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her gray eyes meeting his without flinching. "I have seen what happens when a man with power and no conscience decides to destroy another. I saw it in St. Louis. I will not stand by and watch it happen here." Her words, delivered with such unexpected ferocity, broke through his reserve. He saw in her face a reflection of his own frustration, his own sense of righteous anger. He stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in." She spread her papers on his large oak desk. They were old plat maps of the valley dating back to the town's founding. Blackwood's claim hinges on a flawed survey, she said, her finger tracing the faded lines of Crimson Creek. But the original town charter and the initial land grants are based on that same survey. If he successfully invalidates it to claim your water rights, he inadvertently invalidates the deeds to half the properties in Redemption Creek, including his own saloon. Jack stared at the map, a slow spark of hope igniting within him. He had been focused on his own deeds, his own history. He had not considered the broader implications. Eleanor had seen the flaw in Blackwood's strategy, a weakness born of his own arrogance. "He's trying to cut down one tree, not realizing he's severing the roots of the whole forest," Jack murmured, a grim smile, touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "Precisely," Eleanor said. "He is a bully, not a strategist. He assumes no one will have the diligence or the intelligence to look beyond his immediate attack." For the first time since the robbery, Jack felt he was no longer fighting alone. Eleanor's keen mind and quiet courage were a formidable asset. That night they worked for hours, comparing maps, examining old land deeds, and drafting a legal argument that would expose Blackwood's claim as a threat to the entire community. As they worked, the formal barrier between them began to dissolve. He saw past the reserved schoolteacher to the sharp, resilient woman beneath. She, in turn, saw past the guarded, grieving rancher to the determined man fighting for his home. Their alliance, forged in the shared pursuit of justice, was slowly becoming something more. The fight was far from over, but now there was a glimmer of light in the darkness. The battle for Redemption Creek escalated. Armed with the legal strategy Eleanor had devised, Jack presented their findings to the town council. He demonstrated how Silas Blackwood's claim, if successful, would throw every property title in the valley into chaos. Fearful landowners who had once been swayed by Blackwood's whispers now looked at him with renewed suspicion. For a brief moment, the tide seemed to turn. But Blackwood was relentless. He retaliated not through the law, but with fire. A cry of fire from a passing rider woke Jack in the dead of night. He threw on his boots and ran outside. The sky to the north glowed a hellish orange. It was the hay barn, the largest on his property, filled with the winter feed for his herd. By the time he and his men reached it, the structure was a roaring inferno, the heat so intense it warped the air. They fought the blaze for hours, a desperate losing battle against the hungry flames, succeeding only in preventing it from spreading to the other buildings. By dawn, the barn was a smoking skeleton, its contents reduced to a mountain of black ash. The loss was devastating, a crippling blow just weeks before the first snow. There was no proof, no one to say they saw who lit the match, but everyone knew. It was Blackwood's answer to their legal challenge. He was escalating the conflict from a war of paper to a war of violence. The threat was no longer just financial. It was deadly. The next day, Jack's foreman, Hank, was found on the road to town, his horse wandering nearby. He had been ambushed, dragged from his saddle, and beaten severely. He was left with a broken arm and a chilling message carved crudely into his saddle. Thorn next. The law remained impotent. Sheriff Miller visited the ranch, his face grim. "I've questioned Blackwood's men. They've all got alibis. He's insulated himself, Jack. He's too smart to be caught holding the match." Frustration festered into a cold resolve. If the law couldn't stop Blackwood, Jack would have to find another way. He and Eleanor began their own investigation, a clandestine effort to unearth the truth about Silas Blackwood's past. Eleanor, using a connection from her life in St. Louis, a clerk in the telegraph office whom she corresponded with, began sending discreet inquiries. They needed to know who he was before he came to Redemption Creek, what name he had used, what trail he had left. While they waited for a reply, Jack started talking to the old-timers men who had been in the valley for decades. He asked about his father, about the early days of the ranch. He was searching for any connection, however faint, to Blackwood's claims. It was during one of these conversations that a strange detail emerged. An old prospector recalled a family that had owned a small failing claim on land bordering the Thorne property years ago. "Can't remember the name," the old man rasped, "but the father was a bitter man. Always claimed your pa cheated him in a land deal. They left the valley in disgrace not long after." The detail was vague, but it planted a seed of doubt. Was it possible Blackwood's vendetta had roots in a past Jack knew nothing about? Blackwood himself seemed to revel in the psychological torment. He would encounter Jack in town and make cryptic comments, his voice low and laced with malice. "A man reaps what his family sows, Thorne," he said one afternoon in the general store. On another occasion, as Jack rode past the saloon, Blackwood called out, "Be ashamed to lose all this over the sins of your father." He seemed to possess an unnerving, intimate knowledge of the Thorne family, a history that Jack himself was only now beginning to question. One evening, as Blackwood stood on the saloon porch, the setting sun glinted off something in his hand. It was a silver pocket watch. As he snapped the cover closed, Jack caught a brief glimpse of the engraving, a delicate pattern of intertwined roses. The design was identical to the one on Sarah's locket. Jack's blood ran cold. It was a common design, he told himself, a simple coincidence. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew it was not. The constant threat and shared purpose drew Jack and Eleanor closer. In the quiet hours of the night, as they pieced together the fragments of their investigation, their conversations drifted from legal strategy to more personal matters. He found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't with anyone since Sarah's death. One night his defenses finally crumbled. He pulled the mangled locket from his pocket and placed it on the desk between them. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The bullet from the robbery. It lodged in here. It saved my life." He told her everything about the raid, about the 5 years of hollow grief, about the guilt he carried for not being there to protect her. Eleanor listened, her gray eyes filled with a profound empathy. When he was finished, she reached across the desk and gently touched his hand. "Grief is not a weakness, Jack. It is a measure of the love you lost." Then for the first time she shared her own story. She spoke of her guardian in St. Louis, a wealthy and powerful uncle who had controlled every aspect of her life after her parents died. He had arranged a marriage for her, a business transaction, to a man 3 times her age. When she refused, he had locked her away, threatening to have her committed to an asylum. Her flight to Redemption Creek was not an adventure. It was an escape. In their shared histories of loss and flight, they found a powerful connection. Their bond, which had begun as a pragmatic alliance, was deepening into something more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and a burgeoning, unspoken affection. He admired her courage and intellect. She was drawn to his steadfast strength and the deep well of kindness he tried so hard to conceal. They were 2 wounded souls who had found in each other a reason to fight for a future that had until recently seemed impossible. Weeks of investigation yielded a crucial piece of information. The telegraph from Eleanor's contact in St. Louis finally arrived. Silas Blackwood had operated under a different name in the Kansas Territory, Cyrus Vance. The name sent a jolt through Jack. It was Eleanor's last name. But the rest of the message was more revealing. Cyrus Vance, or Silas Blackwood, had a history of acquiring property through intimidation and ruin, leaving a trail of bankrupt ranchers and broken men in his wake. Armed with this knowledge, Jack decided it was time for a direct confrontation. He found Blackwood in his newly opulent saloon sipping whiskey at a private table. The room fell silent as Jack strode in his spurs, echoing on the polished floorboards. "We need to talk, Blackwood," Jack said, his voice low and even. Silas looked up, a lazy, mocking smile on his face. "Thorn, to what do I owe the pleasure? Come to concede the water rights." "I know about Kansas," Jack said, ignoring the question. "I know about Cyrus Vance." The smile on Blackwood's face didn't falter, but a dangerous light flickered in his eyes. "You've been busy. But a man's past is his own business." "It becomes my business when you bring your war to my doorstep," Jack countered. "This has to end. Whatever debt you think you're owed, whatever grudge you're holding, it's gone on long enough." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You think this is about a simple grudge? This is about justice, Thorn. It's about a debt that has been left unpaid for a generation." He reached into his coat and produced a worn, folded document, tossing it onto the table. "This might educate you." Jack picked it up. It was a letter, the ink faded with age, written in a cramped, angry script. It was addressed to a Mr. Alistair Blackwood and signed by Jack's own father, Marcus Thorn. The letter detailed the final terms of a land sale, the very land that now constituted the northern pasture of the Thorn Ranch. The price was insultingly low, and the tone of the letter was cold, predatory, and dismissive. It spoke of foreclosure and of Alistair Blackwood's inability to manage his affairs. "My father, Alistair Silas," said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He was a prospector, not a rancher. Your father knew he was in debt. He waited until my family was desperate, on the verge of starvation, and then he bought our land he knew was rich with water and grazing for pennies on the dollar. He didn't just buy it, he stole it. He broke my father's spirit and drove my family from this valley with nothing but the clothes on our backs." He produced another document, a faded deed of sale signed by his father, with a trembling, uncertain hand. The evidence was compelling, painting a picture of Marcus Thorn not as the visionary pioneer Jack remembered, but as a ruthless opportunist. "My father died a broken man a few years later." Silas continued, his voice, now a low, venomous hiss. "He made me swear an oath on his deathbed that I would one day return and reclaim what was stolen from us. That I would make the Thorn family pay for their sins. I've spent 20 years building my fortune, Thorn, all for this. All to fulfill that promise. This isn't about money. It's about honor. It's about restoring my family's name by destroying yours." The revelation struck Jack like a physical blow. He stared at the documents, at the cold, hard proof of his father's avarice. The conflict, which he had seen as a clear case of good versus evil, was now shrouded in a fog of moral ambiguity. He was not just defending his land. He was defending a legacy built on another family's ruin. Silas Blackwood was no longer just a villain. He was a son seeking vengeance for a generational wound, and Jack, the inheritor of that tainted legacy, was left questioning everything he had ever believed about his family and himself. Shaken and disoriented, Jack spent the following days in a state of moral crisis. He rode out to the old prospector's shack, the man who had first mentioned the bitter land deal, and pressed him for more details. The story the old man told, corroborated by another longtime resident, confirmed the essence of Blackwood's claim. The land acquisition had been entirely legal. His father had exploited foreclosure laws, not broken them, but it had been undeniably ruthless. Marcus Thorn had built his empire on the foundation of Alistair Blackwood's failure. The knowledge settled in Jack's gut like a stone tainting his memories of the father he had idolized. Silas Blackwood, sensing his advantage, pressed it mercilessly. He shared his story with anyone in town who would listen, casting himself as the wronged son and Jack as the beneficiary of a stolen legacy. Public opinion, already fragile, began to sway. People looked at Jack differently, their sympathy replaced by a cautious judgment. The Thorn name, once a symbol of prosperity and leadership, was now tarnished by the sins of the past. With Jack's moral authority undermined, Blackwood shifted his focus, escalating his threats from Jack's property to the people he cared about most. The danger became chillingly personal. Eleanor, walking home from the schoolhouse one evening, became aware of footsteps behind her. Two of Blackwood's men followed her, staying just far enough back to be unnerving, their silent presence a clear and calculated threat. They shadowed her all the way to her small cottage, peeling off into the darkness only when she had safely bolted her door. The incident left her shaken, but more determined than ever. The threat against Lily was even more direct. A week later, she went for a ride on her favorite mare, a gentle, sure-footed horse she had raised from a foal. As she neared a rocky canyon on the edge of Thorn land, a rider, his face obscured by a low-slung hat, burst from a thicket of trees, firing a pistol into the air. Lily's horse, terrified by the sudden noise, reared and bolted. The mare galloped wildly through the treacherous terrain, Lily clinging desperately to the reins. It was only her exceptional skill as a horsewoman that saved her from being thrown and killed. She managed to guide the panicked animal to safer ground, eventually calming her, but she rode back to the ranch, pale and trembling. When Jack heard what had happened, his moral confusion incinerated in a blaze of pure, protective rage. Blackwood had crossed a line. This was no longer about land or honor or the grievances of their fathers. By threatening Eleanor and Lily, Blackwood had made the fight a matter of survival. Jack sent word for Eleanor to move into the main ranch house where he and his men could protect her. He confined a protesting Lily to the ranch, forbidding her from riding alone. The ranch house became a fortress, and Jack Thorn, his internal conflict resolved by the clarity of imminent danger, prepared for the final confrontation. He would not lose anyone else he loved. Not again. The day began with an unnatural stillness. The sky, a bruised yellow-gray canvas, pressed down on the valley, suffocating the light and sound. The air was heavy, static, and tasted of dust. A sandstorm was coming. By midday, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that grew into a furious shriek. Dust whipped from the dry plains rose in a solid wall, swallowing the horizon and plunging Redemption Creek into a premature twilight. The storm was a physical manifestation of the chaos that had seized Jack's life. It was within this maelstrom that a frantic ranch hand found him, his face covered in a grime-streaked bandana. "It's Lily," the man shouted over the wind's roar. "She's gone. Her horse is in the stable, but she's nowhere on the ranch." A cold dread sharper than the stinging sand pierced Jack's heart. He and Eleanor searched the house, their calls lost to the storm. On Lily's bed they found a note weighted down by a rock. The handwriting was crude, the message simple. "The saloon. The deed for the girl. Come alone." Jack's rage was a white-hot, silent thing. He strapped on his gun belt, his movements precise and economical. Eleanor grabbed his arm, her face pale with fear. "You can't go alone, Jack. It's a trap." "He has my niece Jack," said his voice a low growl. "This ends tonight." He wrapped a bandana around his face and stepped out into the tempest. The world was a swirling vortex of sand and fury. Visibility was less than 20 feet. The town, normally a short ride away, felt like a continent. He leaned into the wind, his horse fighting for every step, the storm a relentless physical assault. The main street of Redemption Creek was a ghost town, its buildings little more than faint silhouettes in the maelstrom. The only light came from the saloon, its windows casting a sickly yellow glow that barely penetrated the swirling dust. Jack dismounted, tying his horse to the rail, the sound of the swinging saloon doors, a frantic, rhythmic banging in the wind. He pushed them open and stepped inside. The eerie quiet within was a stark contrast to the storm's fury. The air was still thick with the smell of stale whiskey and fear. Silas Blackwood stood behind the bar, calmly polishing a glass. Lily was tied to a chair in the center of the room, a gag over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Two of Blackwood's men stood guard rifles in their hands. "Right on time," Thorne Blackwood said, his voice unnervingly casual. He gestured to the deed in Jack's hand. "Place it on the bar. Then you and the girl can walk out of here. My quarrel is with your family's legacy, not your lives." Jack walked forward slowly, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. He placed the signed deed on the polished wood. "Let her go first." Blackwood smiled, a cold, empty thing. "You're not in a position to bargain." He nodded to one of his men who moved toward Lily. But as Jack's focus was on the girl, Blackwood spoke again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It was never about the land, Thorne. The land was just the leverage. A way to wound you, to take from you what your father took from mine. But the prize was always something else." He reached into his vest and pulled out the silver pocket watch. He snapped it open. "My mother gave this to me," he said, "a matching one to my sister. For protection. A reminder of family." He turned the watch and Jack saw the engraving again, against the intertwined roses. The exact match to the design on Sarah's locket. The world tilted on its axis. Sarah, Jack breathed the name, a ragged whisper. "You didn't know," Silas sneered, a terrible grief-stricken rage twisting his features. "You lived with her, you loved her, and you never once asked about the family she fled, about the brother she left behind." He tore the bandana from his own neck. "My name is Silas Blackwood. My sister was Sarah Blackwood, the woman you called your wife." The truth crashed down on Jack with the force of a physical blow. The shared design, the intimate knowledge of his family, the deep personal nature of the hatred, it all made a horrible, tragic sense. "She ran away from us," Silas spat, his composure finally cracking. "From our father. He was a hard man, controlling, abusive. She chose you, a stranger, over her own blood. After she left, our family's luck turned. Our business failed, my mother fell ill. Our father blamed it all on the shame of her elopement, on the loss of the wealthy marriage he had arranged for her. My vendetta is not for a patch of dirt, Thorne. It's for my family's lost honor. It's for the death of the sister I loved, the sister you failed to protect." He slammed his fist on the bar, his eyes wild with a pain that had festered for years. In his grief-fueled confession, one last terrible secret spilled out. That outlaw raid. It wasn't random. He choked out tears of rage and sorrow, finally tracking paths through the grime on his face. "My own father hired them. He hired those men just to scare you off, to bring her home. But they were animals. The plan, it went horribly wrong." Silas's breath hitched, the confession hanging in the air, a truth more monstrous than any lie. "I've lived with that every day. The guilt, the rage. It twisted me. I couldn't hate my father, so I chose to hate you. The man she chose over us. The man who wasn't there when she needed him most." The sandstorm raged outside, a symphony for two families destroyed by pride and grief. In that moment, Jack saw past the villain. He saw a broken man, a brother mourning his sister, his soul poisoned by a secret he could no longer bear. The rage in Jack's heart gave way to a profound, aching clarity. This wasn't a fight for land or revenge. It was a reckoning with a shared tragedy. He took a step forward, his hands open. "Silas," he said, his voice filled with a sorrow that mirrored the other man's. "We both loved her. This isn't what she would have wanted." The mention of their shared love seemed to shatter the last of Silas's control. With a raw cry of anguish, he lunged for the shotgun beneath the bar. The room exploded into motion. Jack dove for cover as the shotgun blast tore a hole in the wall behind him. He fired back, aiming for Silas's arm. The struggle was brutal, intimate, and desperate, a fight not just between two men, but between two unbearable griefs. As they wrestled for the gun, the saloon doors burst open. Sheriff Miller and a posse of townsmen stood silhouetted against the swirling dust, their rifles raised. The storm outside began to subside. Its fury spent the first rays of a weary sun breaking through the haze. Silas froze. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a devastating emptiness. The shotgun clattered to the floor. He looked at Jack, his eyes no longer filled with hate, but with the hollow void of a man whose life's purpose had just crumbled into ash. He sank to his knees, a broken man in a silent room, and surrendered. In the storm's quiet aftermath, the world felt scoured clean. Jack untied Lily, holding her tight as she sobbed into his chest, the fear finally giving way to relief. He then went to Eleanor, who had waited with the posse, her face a canvas of anxiety. He took her hands, his grip conveying everything he couldn't yet say. They were safe. The fight was over. He watched as Sheriff Miller led a compliant, hollow-eyed Silas to the town jail. Later that evening, Jack went to the small stone building. He found Silas sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the silver watch in his hands. Jack didn't speak of forgiveness. The wounds were too deep, the betrayals too profound for such easy words. Instead, he spoke of Sarah. "She told me she was an orphan," Jack said quietly, standing outside the bars. "I never questioned it. I think she wanted to protect me from your father. And maybe she wanted to protect herself from the memory of him." Silas looked up, his eyes filled with a shared, painful understanding. "She was strong, stronger than any of us." "Yes," Jack agreed, "she was." There was no easy forgiveness, no simple resolution to a tragedy that had branched through two families, poisoning them from the roots up. But in that small jail cell, as two men who had loved the same woman looked at the wreckage of their lives, there was a quiet reckoning. Jack left Silas with his grief and returned to the ranch, to a new painful truth he now had to reconcile with his idealized memories. He found Eleanor waiting up for him in the kitchen. She had a fresh pot of coffee brewing and a plate of food she knew he wouldn't eat. They didn't need to speak at first. She simply sat with him at the long wooden table, her presence a warm, steady anchor in the disorienting sea of revelations. And then he talked. Through the long hours of the night, as the last vestiges of the storm blew themselves out, he told her everything. He spoke of the Sarah he knew and the Sarah he had just discovered. He spoke of his father's sins and Silas's sorrow. He laid bare the raw, complicated truth of his past, holding nothing back. Eleanor listened not with pity, but with a deep, unwavering empathy. She understood the weight of a painful history, the struggle to build a future free from the shadows of the past. By the time the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, their bond, forged in crisis and tempered by truth, was stronger and more unbreakable than ever. Months passed. The valley healed under the warm autumn sun. The story of Silas Blackwood became a somber legend in Redemption Creek, a cautionary tale of how grief could curdle into vengeance. Silas, convicted of kidnapping and assault, had been sent to a federal prison in another territory. His confession of his father's crimes, ensuring he would remain there for a long time. Jack Thorne was a changed man. The walls he had built around his heart had been shattered by the storm of Silas's revelations. The grief for Sarah remained, but it was no longer a hollow ache that defined him. It had been transformed into a more complex sorrow, layered with a tragic understanding of the family she had fled, and the brother who had loved her in his own destructive way. He had found a new purpose, not just in protecting his ranch and Lily, but in building a life that looked forward instead of back. His relationship with Eleanor had blossomed into a quiet, steady love. It was a partnership built on a foundation of absolute honesty and mutual support. She was his confidant, his counsel, and the calm center of his world. One clear, crisp afternoon, Jack took Eleanor to a small hill that overlooked the entire ranch. The valley spread before them, a tapestry of gold and green under the vast Montana sky. In his hands, he carried a small shovel and a newly purchased sapling, a young oak tree wrapped in burlap. He didn't speak as he dug a small hole in the rich earth. When he was done, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the mangled silver locket. He held it for a moment, tracing the crater where the bullet had struck a final silent farewell to the woman who had saved his life, even in death. Then he placed it gently in the bottom of the hole. From his other pocket, he produced Silas's silver watch, which the sheriff had given to him before Silas was transferred. He laid it in the earth next to the locket. Two matching tokens of a brother's and a husband's love, side by side at last. He and Eleanor worked together, carefully planting the young sapling over the buried mementos, packing the soil firmly around its base. It was a symbolic act, a laying to rest of the old grief, the old secrets, and the old pain. From the soil of a shared tragedy, something new would now grow strong and rooted in the land they both called home. With the past finally laid to rest, Jack turned to Eleanor. He took both of her hands in his. Eleanor Vance. He began, his voice steady and clear. You came to this town seeking a quiet life, and instead you found my war. You faced it with a courage and intelligence that saved me in more ways than you know. You helped me see the truth, not just about Silas, but about myself. He looked into her clear gray eyes, and the eyes that had seen him at his most broken and had never looked away. My past will always be a part of me, but I don't want it to be the only part. I want to build something new. With you. He knelt on one knee in the soft earth beside the newly planted tree. This is not about replacing what I lost. It's about starting a future with a partner I love and respect more than I can say. Eleanor, will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was as bright and clear as the afternoon sun. She had found more than a sanctuary in Redemption Creek. She had found a home, a purpose, and a man whose quiet strength mirrored her own. Yes, she said, her voice filled with a joy that felt boundless. Yes, Jack, I will. He rose and kissed her, a promise of a future yet to be written. They stood together on the hill, looking out at the sprawling ranch, at the promise of their shared life, stretching out before them as vast and full of hope as the Montana sky.